Hello, I'm William Law, and you're listening to the Arab Digest podcast. My guest today is Tarek Megerisi, a senior policy fellow with the Middle East and North Africa program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Tarek, great to have you back in the podcast.
No, it's always a pleasure to be here, Bill. Thank you so much for inviting me on.
The pleasure is mine. Now, look, before we discuss Libya, I want to get your take on the Trump-Gaza plan. Netanyahu proclaims it a win for Israel, and Trump boasts of bringing peace to the Middle East. The dawn of a golden age for Israel in the Middle East is how he put it. But what do you make of the deal?
Yeesh, we could probably do a whole show on
Yeah.
that alone. Yeah, I was unfortunate enough to have watched some of the signing ceremony in Sharm el-Sheikh last night. It was one of the weirdest pieces of political pageantry I think I've ever seen in my life. There was a lot that was telling about it. I mean, how the fact that you had all the major European heads of state sitting right in the last row, almost as if they're, like the final adornments on Trump's ego that he just lines up there on the mantelpiece. He named each and every one of his Arab partners, who he then humiliated as basically being his funders in this endeavor. And he talked about the Turkish president Erdogan as if he's some kind of thug, big, strong man with his large army, etc., etc. But it's really telling for how he sees all the different parts of the kind of international puzzle. I mean, for the peace plan itself, it's telling again in the pageant there are no Palestinians there, and aren't they supposed to be the kind of victims here and the main point of the peace plan? And if you look at the kind of Knesset speech that he gave just before he went to Egypt, I mean, you quoted some of it. It sounded more like a campaign speech for Netanyahu than it did a peace agreement at the end of a long war like this was. And I think the clearest message from all of this is that now this is the end of Gaza in Trump's mind. I don't think he's going to turn his attention back to it, and that's really it's kind of distressing when you see the defense minister of Israel, Katz, and others talking about how they're just going to continue the genocide and how, as soon as the hostages are back, we're going to start bombing. So this kind of ceasefire looks like that old joke about Israel in the region that, for Israel, a ceasefire means that you cease and we fire. So yeah, I hope your listeners can forgive me for being a bit cynical and suspicious of a peace plan that kind of looks like it's premised on granting complete amnesty to everybody who was involved in any of the crimes of the genocide, and then placing people like Jared Kushner in charge of reconstruction. The idea is that we're all supposed to just close our eyes and wish really, really hard that this is going to lead to a reconstruction of Gaza in the best interests of the Gazans and lead to a Palestinian state. But I mean, really, it kind of just looks like the last step of the genocide, in the sense that you create a path of least resistance for Gazans to exit the strip, whilst you reclaim land in both Gaza and the West Bank, and try and turn the heads of the wider world away from Palestine by saying, "Look, we've got a peace deal." But yeah, I'll stop there. As I
Yeah,
said,
yeah. I think you've summed it up very well, and I think this cynicism, as you said, is sadly much warranted. But look, let us now move on to Libya. And you've published a piece on the Middle East Council for Global Affairs website, which is titled "Are Mediterranean Gas Fields Gold Mines or Volcanoes?" We can't get into the full story here, Tarek, on the podcast, but sketch out for our listeners the bare bones. And I urge people to go to the Middle East Council website. That's mecouncil.org for the whole story. It's a terrific read, a great piece of analysis, and I thank you for putting it out there. But as I said, give us some of the bare bones of what you've unveiled in that piece.
yeah, and thanks a lot for the shout out, Bill, and for the kind words. I suppose just as much praise is due to my poor editor on the piece. As it is to me on this one, who really helped it to come out. I mean, look, basically, in short, I think the crux of the story that I'm trying to tell, or the narrative about the last year in Libya, is that there's a new approach to peace and politics in Libya. and what that says about global diplomacy more generally, which now that I think about it, is kind of linked to your last question. So I can see what you were getting at now. And it's this idea of kind of that you can make peace in Libya and you can make stability and prosperity through marrying the two dictatorships, the government of Abdul Hamid Dbeibeh in Tripoli in Western Libya, and the military dictatorship of the Haftar family in Eastern Libya. And so, if you just divide up Libya's energy assets between these two guys with their international partners, then you'll get peace and you'll get stability. But I don't think it's that simple. I don't think it's going to work like that. We've talked a lot about Libya and over the past few years in various podcasts. And like one lesson that always comes out is that when you make a new agreement for dividing up the pie, the ones who are outside are always going to get pissed off and are always going to want to ruin that deal so that they can get back in the tent and start having that pie. And now we just expanded this to a wider berth. So, you have all the Libyans who are seeing their state wealth kind of coming out the sides with these new energy companies being created that are co-owned between the dictators and that are taking money directly out of the state. You also have other nations like the Greeks and so on who are seeing their best laid plans come to ruin and wanting to block things. And at the end of the day, there is no political resolution here. It's just raw economics. And I think that if you look back, a couple of weeks ago, the US Special Advisor, Masoud Boulos, he kind of bought Ibrahim Dbeibeh and Saddam Haftar for a meeting in Rome to discuss all of this. And the word from that meeting is that Saddam Haftar was adamant that there is no talk about politics. And that's because deep down, the Haftar still really want to take Tripoli. And so you see all the ingredients for war are still there. All the political issues are still there. This is really just kind of a deal to give the illusion of stability by placating all the individual warring parties by allowing them to steal Libya state assets.
And
Um,
Tarek,
yeah.
just give us a picture of just how huge those gas field assets are, because they're offshore, aren't they? Primarily, not all of them, but there's a lot of offshore potential.
Yeah, so most of the interest is focused on the offshore fields, and there are tens of trillions. I can't remember the exact figure. It'll be in the piece if you look for it. But yeah, it's tens of trillions of cubic meters of gas, which is hundreds, if not thousands, of times what Algeria exports in a year, for example. That's the full amount, and that would make Libya a major gas player. But also because this is offshore, there is no settled legal agreement as to who really controls what. Hence why I included the Greeks earlier, because the island of Crete is not so far away from eastern Libya.
Well, all right. You mentioned the other players involved, and one of the points of your article that I found really fascinating was what the Turks are up to. Can you go into that in a little more detail? Because, of course, they rode to the rescue of the Tripoli government in 2020 after Khalifa Haftar had launched his offensive. But now, Tarek, is it the case that Ankara is cozying up to the warlord and his sons?
I mean, I think they're really just laying down the same kind of playbook that they used in Western Libya now to get along with those in Eastern Libya. It's, you offer this kind of military assistance. Turkey has taken some of Saddam Haftar's units for training in Turkey, offering them various weapon sales and agreements and so on.
And of course, Saddam Haftar is Khalifa's son, and is he the main sort of military figure now, Saddam?
So he's basically the heir in waiting. Like the Haftars have done a lot of work over the last year to try to organize the succession plan, as it looks like Daddy Haftar's health issues are getting a lot worse. So Saddam has been gradually foregrounded as the heir apparent. Another one of his sons, Belgasim, is in charge of the reconstruction and development fund. So he's meant to deal with the kind of suit and tie related issues. Khalid, another military son, is meant to kind of deal with internal security and some of the international relationships, but he's very much secondary to Saddam. Haftar is trying to get his house in order, but it's not going as smoothly as he would have hoped. I think there's still a lot of friction between all of his sons.
So the Turks see Saddam as useful.
And you're taking that and you're taking economic partnerships, and then you're using that as the kind of mortar for a more solid political relationship and perhaps even some political leverage further down the line. And this has kind of come off the back of a couple of years of a rapprochement between Turkey and the Haftar's main international partners in the Emirates and so on and so forth. I mean, I pick on Turkey here not because they're the kind of big bad actor and they're the ones who are doing all this, but because they are the kind of the standout player in a broader international milieu who are all equally involved in this and who are all equally kind of guilty of doing diplomacy in Libya in the way I mentioned in response to your last question. So, Turkey are fully focused on trying to maximize their gains in the sense of energy and reconstruction. And they're leveraging their kind of underground influence and their business links with both the Eastern and Western parties to keep the status quo. And when I mean the status quo, it's having Dbeibeh rule the West and Haftar rule the East. And whenever the status quo looks like it's going to collapse, Turkey will come in quickly and kind of slap a patch on it to keep it all moving along. And there was a great example of this earlier in the year when just last month it looked like we might have another war in Tripoli. And then the head of the intelligence services, Ibrahim Kalin, he came to Tripoli, he negotiated with all sides, and they kind of stood down. Their peace agreement is not going to last either, I don't think, but it's a patch. It's not a solution, to use the engineering terms.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're also trying to kind of stitch together this international consensus position around prioritizing developing Libyan energy right now. And again, it's a really interesting insight into the world of diplomacy these days that when Masoud Boulos was coming to Libya in the summer, while he was in Libya signing deals in Eastern and Western Libya for the involvement of US energy companies in these developments, his son's nickname in the region is Abu Tiffany.
Oh yes, yeah. Tiffany is Trump's daughter.
They were holidaying in the Mediterranean, according to the New York Times, on a yacht that is owned by BGN. And BGN is really infamous in Libya as a kind of Turkish energy company with a headquarters in Abu Dhabi that is deeply involved in all of the energy, let's call it redevelopment in Libya since 2021. So you can see the kind of private interest and influence as well as the political level or the head of state level influence and diplomacy that's going on.
You're listening to the Arab Digest podcast with me, William Law, and European Council on Foreign Relations Senior Policy Fellow, Tarek Megerisi. Arab Digest has more than the podcast to offer you. We have a daily newsletter, and you can make it your go-to source for independent analysis and fresh insights into the Middle East and North Africa. Head to our website, arabdigest.org, for details on how to get the newsletter for 2 months for free. Check us out at arabdigest.org. There is a possibility that the Haftars are preparing a new offensive against the internationally recognized government, the Dbeibeh government in Tripoli. If that's the case, do you think the Turks would simply stand back, stand down this time around? They wouldn't rush to the defense of Tripoli?
I mean, two sides to this. I mean, firstly, yes, I think the Haftars are always very interested in retaking Tripoli. They tried to use unrest in Western Libya as a kind of casus belli to come in. But at the same time, their position in the East is not as stable as they like to communicate. And so you could foresee a future whereby they try to distract from discontent in Eastern Libya by launching another war in Tripoli. So there are, very clear avenues to another war. I think Turkey's main kind of red line or main guiding principle in Libya is that we don't want to see a return to big war. We don't want any instability. They're not necessarily against the replacement of Dbeibeh out of principle, but they would not like to see it done in what they consider to be a destabilizing way. So I don't think that they would back a military conflict on Tripoli or a military assault on Tripoli, it's also a lot harder to sell and to maintain President Erdogan's kind of narrative of him as a stabilizing character and influence and kind of doing the right thing. But Turkey might play a role in helping to agree a new unity government or replacing the Dbeibeh through political means. But again, I think the main interest right now is just in maintaining the status quo. That means you stop the Dbeibeh starting wars he can't win, and you stop Haftar starting wars he can't win.
Because that's good for business, and the business of energy is what's driving a lot of this politicking. What about Russia? Russia is busy in Libya, and there are two aspects I'd like you to comment on, Tarek. The first is their aspirations for a naval base in Tobruk, and the second, reports of Russian missile systems in the city of Sabah, which is what, roughly 600 kilometers south of Tripoli, and it is in the hands of the Haftars. Those missiles reportedly aimed at Europe. So, what are the Russians up to?
I mean, the Russians are up to a lot. Much like the Turks are kind of a headline country in this idea of short-term profit off of medium to long-term stability. I mean, I think the first thing that you mentioned, the kind of port in Tobruk, is already progressing. If you look at local Russian media, they talk about having a few tens of kilometers squared already kind of parceled away for them, almost like a part of the port that they own. Deals have been made with the Belarusians to kind of develop this port earlier this year, and relations between Eastern Libya and Belarus are booming. There's also talk about, this being a new migrant trail now into Europe. But yeah, the Belarusians are developing the port. The Russians do see it as a future military port. They would like to get a formal lease. That last hop is going to be the most difficult to do legally, administratively, politically, but I think they want to just create the fact on the water. And at the same time, there are broader redevelopments going on. So in the port of Sirt, this is also being redeveloped with Emirati assistance. And it looks like the idea is that Tobruk is kind of tucked away as the natural military port, and Sirt is going to be the kind of energy port. And there are grander plans for building a highway south from Sirt into the Sahel. And I mentioned all of this, the Emirati connection, the connection to the Sahel, and so on, because Russia primarily sees Libya as a conduit to a grander African strategy.
Mm.
The second point that you mentioned of missiles in Sebha, I think is deliberate hyperbole by an Italian general in order to try to get more attention to what is a very real threat. So, the Russians already control multiple military bases across Libya, including the airfield at Jufra, which is a military air base in central Libya, only really a few hundred kilometers away from the NATO headquarters in Segonella in Sicily. And so while they're not aiming missiles at Europe, they are able to kind of impact what goes on in Sicily. They are kind of weaponizing Libya against Europe in terms of fuel smuggling, destabilization, migrant smuggling. They are using Libya to create more instability in the continent, fueling the civil war in Sudan by bringing in equipment to give to the RSF, supporting their other military operations in places like Mali. And I think that, they're kind of the tip of the spear in this broader vision, which, seems to be to create a sea of chaos between East Africa and West Africa, with some islands of profitability and stability. Look at Sirt and Tobruk as examples of those for the Libya equivalent.
Mm.
And the Russians know that, this endgame hurts Europe, cuts Europe off. They also weaponize disinformation against Europe. There's a lot that can be said here, and if I'm not blowing my own horn too much, I would say as well, look for a paper I published on this with the ECFR, the European Council on Foreign Relations, earlier this year, because it was really a kind of deep dive into the drivers, the motivations, and all of the activities that Russia is doing right now in Libya.
Okay, well, yeah, definitely look for that. Uh, what about Donald Trump and his transactional politicking in the Middle East? Is an already fragile Libya at further risk from a White House that puts commercial interests above all other considerations?
Yeah, we've already talked about the activities of Masoud Boulos, who seems to have been kind of suckered in by this Turkish vision that You let us handle the ground. We're all going to make lots of money by redeveloping the offshore fields, but then also the other gas fields near the border with Algeria. And I think that this is deeply destabilizing. I mean, I mentioned before about how, the condominiums that are created in order to manage this new energy activity, they basically take money out of Libya, weakening the national oil company, weakening the state, who's 90 something percent, 97 or 98% of the state revenues come from oil, come from energy. So you are impoverishing a state that has not been governed for 15 years plus, 15 years since the revolution, and Gaddafi was, hardly the height of a statesman or a good governor before then. The political issues that are on the ground are there and they are festering. Various Libyans will try and push back on these developments, so there's no promise that they will even work. You have other powers like the Algerians nearby who are deeply concerned about how Libya is being destabilized. You have a UN mission which finally, after a long time of waiting, seems to have a kind of savvy and enthusiastic and engaged SRSG, which is basically being sidelined because we know Donald Trump doesn't like the UN. So we have a potential path that is so much better, but we're ignoring it for a kind of short term belief in profitability, a potential of profitability that is not even being realized, and which probably won't be realized for a long time. And so, yeah, this deification of commercialism is really hurting the prospects of genuine stability, of a genuine political process, of genuine progress in Libya.
Yeah, and as you say, the national oil company has been hamstrung, and you have all of these outside forces, commercial interests, kind of circling around, almost like vultures, really getting ready to pounce, and various players engaged. You mentioned the UAE, of course, and Russia and the Turks, and there's a situation with the Greeks, and it all says just how volatile the situation is right now for Libya and the Libyans. I'm thinking back, Tarek, to an earlier podcast we did, and I remember closing with a question about how you were feeling then about Libya going forward, and you replied with cautious pessimism. I think was the phrase you were cautiously pessimistic.
Yeah, it
Um,
sounds like me.
yeah, but I wonder where you are now on Libya's future.
I mean, look, it's my job to kind of try to find a solution amidst the mess, or try and find the way out amidst the broader chaos. But I it's hard to see who your partner is for progress here. It's hard to see another actor who shares values, who shares a kind of developed understanding in the sense that you need a stable country in order to really be able to profit from it. I mean, you can see a future. Why can't Libya develop its offshore fields or develop other gas fields? But this should be being done through the national oil company so that the state gets to benefit, and that these proceeds can kind of fuel a political process, be used as a carrot and a stick in order to ensure good governance, not as a kind of replacement for it, and kind of empowering these two-bit poor man Gaddafis in eastern and western Libya. But this is what everybody is invested in right now. We have a deeply underfunded, under-resourced, underappreciated UN. And so long as the UN mission in Libya exists, it must be the vehicle for driving a political process, because that's how you stop an overt scramble for Libya going on. It's how we protect the last tenets of international diplomacy and so on. But none of these things exist right now. So you're basically talking into the void, and you're preparing plans, and you're preparing solutions for when a partner might appear. Because you also know that not everything stays the same forever. There will come a point where Turkish interests are frustrated and they are again more interested in the political process, and then perhaps we have a time to work on that. There will come a point where the Italians realize they cannot manage migration from Libya in the same way, or the Europeans see that the threat from Russia is much deeper than they perhaps gave it credit for. And then that creates the political capital needed to really invest in the process. So, cautiously pessimistic, I think, is a good tagline for me because things don't look good. Things really depressingly don't look good, but times change, currents move in different directions, and you just have to be ready to kind of act when they are.
Okay, so we'll leave it at cautiously pessimistic and hope that the needle shifts towards more optimism in days and months and years to come. Thanks again, Tarek.
Thank you very much, Bill. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
You've been listening to the Arab Digest podcast. My guest today was Tarek Megerisi, a senior policy fellow with the Middle East North Africa program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. The Middle East is the single most important story in the world today, and getting a grip in it has never been more important. That's what Arab Digest does, week in, week out, with the podcast and our daily newsletter. Here at the Digest, we have a team of analysts, commentators, and writers, contributors like Tarek, providing acute insights and fresh perspectives you simply will not find anywhere else. And here's something else to think about. As pressures pile on and threaten independent journalism, we are an independent voice. No sponsors, no advertising. Our funding comes only from our subscribers. If you'd like to support that independent voice and plug into everything Arab Digest has to offer, and that includes our daily newsletter, head to our website at arabdigest.org, where we have a free 2-month trial to the newsletter on offer. Follow us on Facebook, X, and LinkedIn, and search our library of more than 300 podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, or other platforms. Thank you for listening. I'm William Law, editor of the Arab Digest, essential reading, essential listening from independent sources.